Given there are so many titles in wrestling, it's understandable that some reigns are going to go forgotten, as they just don't leave us with anything memorable to grasp onto. But what are the most notable examples of this in WWE history? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now, starting with the time Shotzi Blackheart and Ember became NXT Women's Tag Team Champions. Why was this one so forgettable? Well, the pair never really established themselves as a team for very long before winning the belts, and once they did get the titles, their reign wasn't long either. And on top of that, the duo had no real memorable moments from their run together. Yes, this was yet another example of the thrown-together duo who had very little in common and was only together to keep the belts warm for a while, with their reign starting on the March 10th, 2021 episode of NXT, mere minutes after Dakota Kai and Raquel Gonzalez had been crowned inaugural champions. And after they won the belts, Shotsy and Ember proceeded to do nothing with them for the next 55 days. In fact, the most notable thing which happened during their time as champions at all was when they lost them to The Way on May 4th. Still, at least this established the pair as a great new team within the WWE system, right? Well, not quite, because after losing their gold, the Californian and the Texan would go their separate ways, with these separate ways being the main roster for Shotsy, where she's most recently found herself in a feud with Damage Control, and AEW for Ember where she's since reverted back to her old name of Athena. So even if their tag team title run together was a bit of a wash, things worked out in the end for the unlikely pair. But not all forgotten tag team champions in NXT are makeshift duos. No, some are already established before winning the belts, as was the case with our next subjects, MSK. Of course, MSK's time with the NXT tag team titles has been spread across 2 runs, but while that first one certainly had its issues, mostly because of the time period it happened in, it's the second one we want to focus on today, as that's the one which has really gone forgotten in the years since. Why is this? Well, it's certainly not a lack of talent from the 2 men involved. No, Wesley and Nash Carter were always great, and this is something that they'd repeatedly proved during their time working in TNA as the Rascals prior. Unfortunately though, when they joined NXT, it was during the days of the empty arena era, meaning they never really felt like they got a chance to shine as bright as they could have. And this was never more evident than during their second run with the tag team straps, a run which came in the spring of 2022. After all, this was the reign that lasted for all of 5 days before it came to a crashing and sudden end, with such a short period of time causing the pair to have no opportunity to do anything with the belts other than effectively transition them over from Imperium to Pretty Deadly. Why were they stripped of their gold here? Well, because Nash Carter had been fired after getting himself into a behind-the-scenes controversy. And so, like that, the time of MSK in WWE came to a crashing end. Or at least it would for a while, because in recent weeks, with NXT and TNA's relationship starting to bloom, it's meant we've been able to see something of a Rascals reunion on NXT. And who knows, maybe this means they'll even finally be able to get that memorable run with the tag team gold on the developmental brand at some point. But they're not the only team still looking for a memorable run to make up for a forgettable prior one, as despite their greatness, few teams have had as poor of an NXT tag team title run as Mustache Mountain. Yes, if you were an NXT fan during the Black and Gold era, then you knew how great the duo made up of Tyler Bate and Trent Seven were. It didn't matter if it was on the UK branch of the show or the US one, they always delivered every time they stepped in the ring. And the way they did this was by bringing their British strong style with them and utilizing it so well, there were few who could match up to them once the bell rang. So you think it would be a given the 2 boys from Wolverhampton would get a significant tag team title reign then, right? Well, while they would get this with the NXT UK tag team titles, with their time with these belts lasting for 174 days, when it came to the US versions of the same gold, that one would be far shorter lived and far less eventful. What happened here exactly? To put it bluntly, the Undisputed Era happened. That's right, back during late 2010s NXT, the foursome made up of Adam Cole, Kyle O'Reilly, Bobby Fish, and Roderick Strong absolutely dominated the Black and Gold brand. And this domination meant they were usually in possession of the tag team titles, which was exactly why it felt like such a big moment when Mustache Mountain beat them for the gold on June 19, 2018 in their home country of England. Unfortunately for the Englishman, though, this run on top would prove to be incredibly short-lived, as just 22 days later on an episode of NXT back over in America, they dropped them right back to Kyle O'Reilly and Roderick Strong, with this meaning they had absolutely no time to do anything with the titles while they had them. And because of that, Mustache Mountain's time as NXT Tag Team Champions has since pretty much gone forgotten. But let's move away from the black and gold brand for a moment now, and over to the main roster. As it's there, we find our next subject, Randy Orton, and the time he became United States Champion. Now, when you think of all the times Randy Orton has held gold around his waist throughout his illustrious career, it's easy to think of those times he was the World Champion. After all, there are 14 options to choose from there. And if you don't think of that, then you might even think of his early Intercontinental title reign, which saw him memorably feud with Mick Foley, that or his tag team title runs with Edge or Matt Riddle. What you probably don't think about, though, is the time he was United States Champion in 2018, as this has since gone so forgotten, it's hard to remember it happened at all. So what was the story here? Why was the Viper given the mid-card belt so late into his career? Well, it appears this was a case of WWE trying to raise the profile of the belt by giving it to a legitimate main eventer for a while. Unfortunately, though, the run Orton went on here was so short-lived, it did little to revive the prestige of the once prized gold. Hell, it only lasted 27 days, and during those 27 days, Randy was able to do nothing of note with it. Yes, between winning it from Bobby Roode at March 11th's Fastlane, and then losing it to Jinder Mahal at April 8th's WrestleMania 34, the highlights of his run were nowhere to be found. So perhaps it should come as no surprise that in the years since, Orton has never regained the title. And it's not like he's been left out in the cold because of that, because a man of his status is always going to find something else to occupy himself with. But Randy Orton's United States title run isn't the only hugely forgettable mid-card run in relatively recent WWE history, as the exact same thing could be said about the time CM Punk became Intercontinental Champion in 2009. Yes, you could argue that almost any Intercontinental title run from this period is forgettable, as it was the point where the least care was being given to a belt that had once been so proudly held by the likes of Macho Man Randy Savage, Bret the Hitman Hart, and Mr. Perfect. But even by the standards of forgettable late 2000s, early 2010s reigns with the IC strap, this one takes the cake. And the reason it takes the cake is because CM Punk holding a title back then should have felt like a big deal. Sure, he was still a few years away from dropping a pipe bomb and reaching the main event, but Punk was clearly a star in waiting by the time 2009 rolled around, something which was evident in the fact he'd already held the World Heavyweight title once. So you'd think he'd have been able to do something to elevate the secondary prize here. But alas, back then, the Intercontinental title held very little value. And so, for the 49 days Pepsi Phil held it here, nothing of note happened. Of course, it also didn't help that mere months later, Punk would start his second of 3 runs with the World Heavyweight title, and with that belt being considered much more important at the time, it was quickly seen as the real attempt to elevate the Chicago native. So because of this, it was even easier to forget he'd ever been Intercontinental Champion at all, and much easier to completely file this one away into the bargain bin of history. Could things have been different if Punk had been given a good story to work with during his run? Could it have maybe elevated the gold back up to the levels it deserved to be at, years before Gunther managed to do this once more? It's hard to say, but there's certainly a possibility we could have been looking at the IC strap as being something important again heading into the 2010s if things had played out differently. But instead, what we got was what we got. And the reign which followed this would only make things worse, as that was the reign of JBL. Yes, when most fans think of JBL, they likely associate him with his time as a WWE champion on SmackDown in the mid-2000s, and if they're not thinking of that, they'd probably think of the times he'd held the tag team belts with Farouk back at the turn of the millennium. What most are almost certainly not thinking of, however, is the time John Bradshaw Layfield held the Intercontinental title back in 2009. But to be fair to JBL, it's not like he had any opportunity to do much of note during his reign, as after beating CM Punk for the gold on the March 9th, 2009 episode of Raw, he'd only hold on to it for 26 days before dropping it to Rey Mysterio at WrestleMania 25 in what turned out to be his final match. So why was he given the belt at all here? Was it a way of saying thank you and giving him a metaphorical gold watch before he hung up his boots? Was it a way of using his heel status to transition the title between two baby faces? Probably a little from column A and a little from column B, if we're being honest. Whatever the reason, the reality was the same in the end, and that reality was that this was a title reign few had any reason to care about. And so because of that, it should come as no surprise it's been largely forgotten. Hell, even the ending was underwhelming as it saw the Texan get beaten by Mysterio in just 21 seconds. Still, at least things would eventually turn around for the IC strap, though it would take a while for us to get to that point. That said, when it was having a revival of fortunes during the 2020s, other belts were having their own spells of being devalued. And one of the most prominent examples of this happening can be found in the time Nikki ASH became Raw Women's Champion in 2021. Yes, considering this one happened so recently, and considering it happened on the main roster, the fact it's since gone forgotten by many fans should tell you everything you need to know about this one. After all, when someone wins a world title on WWE's flagship show, it should feel like a big deal. Unfortunately, in the case of Nikki ASH, however, her run with the gold back at the turn of the decade cannot be described as memorable. Why is that? Well, because there was nothing of note that happened during the reign. The reason this one happened at all, in fact, was because a few months prior, Nikki had won the Money in the Bank contract, with this guaranteeing her a title shot at a time of her choosing. So obviously not wanting to have someone lose their cash-in attempt that year, the company chose to have the Scotswoman defeat Charlotte Flair when she cashed in on her during the July 19th episode of Raw that year. The only problem with this was, with there clearly being no follow-up plans for the almost a superhero, her subsequent run with the gold provided nothing worth talking about, and no great matches worthy of note. No, all that happened here was the new champ held on to the belt for 32 days, and then dropped it back to Charlotte again at SummerSlam. Obviously then, this did not elevate Nikki to the main event level, and it didn't help to add to the history of the belt either. Really, it's hard to think of a modern-day title reign that failed so much. Hell, so much damage would it do, it wouldn't be until Nikki ASH reverted back to Nikki Cross and joined the Wyatt Six 3 years later that she felt like she was able to regain her momentum. Of course, this isn't the only forgettable women's title reign that has happened on WWE TV in recent years. No, far from it. In order to look back at the other one, though, we have to venture back to developmental, as that's where we'll find Indy Hartwell's ill-fated run with the NXT Women's title back in 2023. Now, considering how high Triple H appeared to be on Indy Hartwell when he was booking NXT, you'd have thought that big things were in her future in 2023. After all, she was a major focus for a while there in that her storyline with Dexter Lumis was one of the top angles on 2.0. And so, her finally winning the gold should have felt like a crowning moment then, a sign that she'd finally arrived and was ready to lead a division. Except this is not what happened. Rather, when the Melbourne native won a ladder match at April 1st's Stand and Deliver show that year, she would have a run which lasted all of 31 days and which gave us nothing memorable, all before she then vacated it on May 2nd. But to be fair to Indy, this wasn't exactly her fault. No, the failure of her title run to be remembered had less to do with her talents and more to do with factors beyond her control. What were these factors? Well, they were twofold. First, there was the fact that almost immediately after winning the belt, the new champ suffered a foot injury, meaning she was not going to be cleared to step into the ring in the immediate future. And as if that wasn't a bad enough sign for her NXT Women's title reign, there was also the fact that during the 2023 draft, she'd be called up to Raw, with this meaning she wasn't going to be available to show up on Tuesday nights any longer. It should go without saying then that both of these factors combined meant there was no possibility of Hartwell's time with the developmental gold lasting any longer. And so this was why we got the moment we got where she relinquished the belt only a month after winning it. Could things have been different if she hadn't got injured or called up so soon? Yeah, we have no doubt she would have had a decent run, certainly something that would have been better remembered by fans than what actually happened. But that's not the way things worked out. No, instead, this is yet another title reign which has been forgotten to time. And the NXT Women's title wasn't alone in this respect during the early 2020s, as that brand's men's world title had the same thing happening to it in 2022 when Dolph Ziggler briefly won it. Now, to tell this story, we have to tell the story of where NXT was as a whole in 2022. Yes, this was not long after the rebrand from the Black and Gold era to the 2.0 era. And with this new era came an all-new focus then. Less time spent with indie wrestlers and more time spent with fresh young athletes who could go on to become WWE superstars. So this is why WWE decided to bring Dolph Ziggler to the developmental show and give him a world title run. And it seems that the reason for this was to have an established star on the roster so he could help elevate those young rookies. But then it's not like NXT didn't already have people on the roster who served such a purpose, so there really was no need for the show-off to appear here. But he did, and after immediately challenging then NXT World Champion Braun Breaker to a match at March 8th, 2022's Roadblock show, he'd proceeded to defeat the youngster when it came time for the bell to ring, with this giving Dolph the honor of becoming the 20th NXT champion. What would he do with the belt now that he had it? Well, not a lot if we're being honest, as the purpose here was never for the Ohio native to have a stellar run. No, the purpose was for him to keep the gold warm for a while until it was time to drop it back. And that meant over the 26 days which followed, little of note would take place with that particular belt. In fact, the only thing memorable about this time is that he defended it once against LA Knight. Aside from that, though, it would be a case of killing time until the April 4th episode of Raw, the point where, in front of the biggest stage Braun Breaker had been on at that time, he was able to regain his lost gold from the show-off. Yes, we see what WWE was going for here, to give the rookie a chance to win the title on a more high-profile show with a bigger audience watching him. What's harder to understand, though, is that there was any value to be found in our next forgotten title run, the time Leon Ruff won the NXT North American title. That's right, let us take you back for a moment to 2020. That was when, with no fans in the arena to create an atmosphere, NXT was throwing everything at the wall in an attempt to see what would stick. And one of the things they decided to try at this point was to take someone who was making one of his first ever appearances on WWE TV and have them win a title right away. That was what happened with Leon Ruff when on the November 11th episode of NXT that year, he accepted the challenge from then North American champion Johnny Gargano and proceeded to beat him in what was considered a huge upset at the time. Obviously then, the idea here was to turn Ruff into a star overnight and quickly elevate him up to a higher level. Unfortunately though, this one didn't turn out as well as when the 1-2-3 Kid beat Razor Ramon and went on to become a star. Because as the weeks went on, it quickly became clear that Ruff was not turning into the instant sensation WWE hoped he would be. But then, in his defense, he didn't get much of a chance to prove himself because with a title run which only lasted 25 days, there was little he could do. That's right, the entire time the Detroit native spent as champion was spent with him playing third wheel to a much more focused upon Johnny Gargano, Damian Priest feud. So it wasn't as if fans were given anything to get behind here. And once it was over, it would be straight back to the twilight zone of irrelevance for the rookie, as he spent the rest of his time in WWE doing nothing of note. Should Leon Ruff have been more? Maybe. At very least, his title run should have been given more of a chance to get out of the starting blocks. But that unfortunately wasn't the case, and so instead, it'll always go down as forgotten, just like every other title reign we've looked at today.